belonging to three different language families. For example, the Indo-Aryan languages of Bihar, that's Maithili, Magadhi, and Angika. Munda languages of Jharkhand and Orissa, Tibeto-Burman languages of Mizoram and Nepal, informing a Sprachbund of multiple agreement comprising a vast chunk of the Himalayan foothills, the east and the northeast of India. Most recently, he's worked on participle agreement in Hindi Urdu that's come out recently in 2021 and is currently working on polar questions in Assamese, Bangla, Hindi, Urdu, and Manipuri. So I'll hand over now. The floor is Tanmoy's. Please welcome Tanmoy.
Thank you, Ira. I hope people will be able to hear the end of the talk, till the end of the talk. They have been patiently waiting. So let me start without any further delay. Before I start the talk, I would like to share an anecdote. It was in 2008 that I organized a mini workshop in our Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi, on education and grammar, and invited, among other people, Hani Babu as well, who is just across the building in the English department. Hani tried various ways to avoid, coming to the meeting and speaking, but I was quite persistent, and I accommodated all his change of time and date, etc. So finally he had to come. And it turned out to be a good presentation, which was later on published in Indian Linguistics that year. But at the beginning of the talk, he mentioned something about his style of presentation. And he said that I don't remember exactly, but he might have said that in my department, people don't give PPT presentations because they think that PPT presentations is required only when you don't have anything substantial to add. So with that, apology to Hani Babu and others who are not fans of PPT presentations or PowerPoint presentations. I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation because there's so many things that I want to show you, like maps and geographical boundaries, etc. But also maybe I don't have much substantial things to talk about. So let me share. I have to ask the host to enable sharing screen because I can't share the screen right now. I will start once I'm able to share, and then I can begin my commentary. It is more or less like a commentary, therefore it is not very substantial. But since it's taking some time for the host to enable screen sharing for me, I will begin anyway and state a kind of preamble to this commentary. So there's a preamble to the commentary, and that is, although my surface focus is the locational, and therefore I will only talk about regions like geographies, groups of people, and languages. The main thrust of the underlying thesis is to highlight the importance of bringing to the fore discussions about the a minority via their peripherality, and thereby question the centrality of what is perceived to be the majority. I believe also in a kind of academic activism that is backed by deep research and not by the discursive alone. So the subtitle of this talk, today's talk, A Case of Diversity at the Periphery, is really the theorem. And the title alludes to the proof, as hopefully we'll see when I'm able to begin the presentation. Vyom, is it possible to allow me to share my screen? Okay, do let me know by.
I think you can share your screen.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes. So hopefully you can see this, all of you. And I'll go on to the first slide called the number game. I thought I'll start with something familiar to many people who know something about languages. This is the whole game about enumeration. And I'll start very early. That is, Hernley, a German Indologist, in 1880 published a book. The title is given here, A Comparative Grammar of the Gorian Languages, with a special reference to Eastern Hindi, which was his real interest in writing the book, but he did a comparative work anyway, which was the great, methodological device that was employed at the turn of the century to great effect, actually. And some people have picked that up in modern times as well. Anyway, I have a quotation from his book. In fact, couple of quotations, and this is the quotation: 7 languages of the Sanskrit stock are usually enumerated. Note the word enumerated here, as spoken in North India, namely Sindhi, Gujarati, Punjabi, Hindi, Bengali, Oriya, Marathi. Okay. This, apart from excluding very crucially Kashmiri and Assamese as other Indo-Aryan languages, a whole mass of land, as you realize, is left out, namely whole of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, most of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which in turn, opens the door for all these other languages spoken in those tracts to be included under Hindi. In fact, Hernley himself continues, of these, Hindi is commonly said to be spoken over an area of more than 248,000 square miles, and to be the language of between 60 to 70 millions of people. That is 1/4 of inhabitants of India. And this last sentence, this statement is true only in a very limited and special sense, which is a correct understanding of the situation as you can see it yourself. But Hernley here was merely continuing an Indian tradition that had perhaps was begun by early Prakrit grammarians. And one of the earliest, in fact, the earliest known Prakrit grammars that we have is Prakrita Prakasha of Vararuchi, whose dates are a little bit uncertain because he went by other names as well. And there are several texts of different genres written with Vararuchi as the author. But whatever it is, certainly during the turn of the millennium, he was around, and he was talking about the types of Prakrits. And he said there are 4 types: Prakrit proper, which later on, grammarians identified as Maharashtri. And there's a whole body of discussion about the place of Maharashtri, whether it is really just a literary poetic language of the kavyas or the poetics, or is it language which was spoken ever. Then Shoraseni Prakrit, that is the central, you could say, central northern variety that we have in the form of, let's say, most dominantly, prominently Hindi Urdu in our new Indo-Aryan period. And then Magadhi. Magadhi is a language in the east, in Bihar. And then Paishachi, which is Paishachi Prakrit, is supposed to be extinct. And there are very interesting stories about this. And then later Prakrit grammarians, I'm switching to the Prakrit grammarians immediately, but I'll come to the Vedic period little bit briefly. And I'm looking at Prakrit grammarians in the East. So medieval Prakrit grammarians all the way to even 16th century. For example, Markandeya, he gave this interesting list of types of Magadhi Prakrit. So there is Magadhi Prakrit, which is the main linguistic variety of the East. And within that, you have Magadhi, Ardhamagadhi, Dakshinatya, Utkali, and Shabari. Now, very interestingly, I picked this list. Actually, he lists about 27 varieties, but I have picked this list because there is something interesting going on here. For example, Ardhamagadhi is a mixed form of Prakrit, mixed language, mixed variety. That is a mixture of the Western, Northern, like Maharashtriya, Sarasani, and the Eastern or Magadhi Prakrit. And then you have this Dakshinatya, which is, well, he conjectures, Markandeya conjectures this to be the language of the Berar region, which is modern times Amravati. So therefore, Marathi. But it cannot be Marathi because the Prakrit grammarians, the Eastern Prakrit grammarians never included Maharashtrian as part of the Eastern Prakrit canon. So I think this is an early form of Northern Dravidian. And interestingly, Natya Shastra, that great text about how how to stage a play, in that Dakshinatya is a variety of language that is assigned to characters like soldiers, police chiefs, and gamesters. So it's very interesting to reconstruct the social of that period. And then also, interestingly enough, you have this Shabari, which is actually Savara, which is a Munda language. And now you find them in the tea plantation in Assam in great numbers, but mainly in the southern tip of Orissa, the Sora speakers, who are actually in the border of northern Andhra Pradesh and Orissa. So this was a very interesting trend that should remind us of what is happening with in our times, let's say, with something like Hindi as a mother tongue. And I'll give you the census figures. And here are the census figures. You can see Hindi as a mother tongue of 2011 census. That is the latest language figures that we have. The fact remains that it does not have one or two languages as part of Hindi, but as many as 56, including a controversial category called other. So you can see the list again, which includes very important and major languages like Awadhi, Bhojpuri, Bundeli, which I have colored out here, Chhattisgarhi, Haryanvi, Hindi, of course, itself, Magadhi, Marwari, Rajasthani, and there are many, as you can see the whole list here. Now, interestingly, this adds up to about 20 crores or 200 million speakers extra on top of Hindi's own 32 crores or 320 million, which actually pushes the Hindi speakers percentage to 43% from 25% in Hernley's time. Remember that Hernley had said 1/4 of India spoke this language. Now let's look at the situation vis-a-vis the Constitution of India. We have this 8th schedule where there are two groups of languages: scheduled languages, which are 22 in number, and non-scheduled languages. Very interestingly, in the scheduled languages, only 22 are recognized, so official languages in the Constitution. And you can see majority of them are actually Indo-Aryan. All those yellowish color are Indo-Aryan, and there are 15 of them. And then you have 4 major Dravidian languages. There are 2, thankfully, Tibeto-Burman languages, 2 now after the inclusion of Bodo, and only 1 in the form of Santali in 18 as a Munda or Austroasiatic language. If you look at the non-scheduled languages, which is a group of 99 languages up till 2011, and I have given only a basic list, not all of them. You can see from the color themselves, you can see there is only one in this my list, only one Bhili or Bhil, which is of Indo-Aryan stock. There are total 8 Indo-Aryan languages which are in the non-scheduled version, 13 Austroasiatic and Dravidian languages. But there are as many as 64 Tibeto-Burman languages. Now, what it tells us that actually this is exactly in terms of numbers and enumerations, it is the case of diversity at the periphery. And if you look at the map of India, and you don't have to look at the map of India alone, you can look at the map of Southeast Asia, you can look at the map of China, you can see the periphery, you can see in the sort of southwestern corridor of China, there are 52 Tibeto-Burman languages spoken. But all China seems to be just speaking Mandarin or Chinese. And then you see the Southeast Asia, you go tip all the way to the ocean in Myanmar, you see many more languages than you see in the central northern zone. And that seems to be a typical case of diversity at the periphery, in the, literally, geographically in the periphery. Now let me roll back a little bit and look at the couple of contrasting view. I'm calling the first set of views as the Orientalist view, and again I will depend on Hurnley for these views. Although Grierson and there are many other scholars in that time, late 19th century, who were proposing something like this, and I call this the East-West story. But you will realize, although I don't have to say it, you'll realize very soon the East-West story actually becomes a North versus the rest story. So again, a quotation from Hurnley's book, 1880. These circumstances, he talks about various things before this, prior to this. These circumstances disclose the fact that sometime in the remote past, Magadhi must have reached up to the extreme western frontiers and been the only language of North India. Okay. Further on, he says that Pashto and Nuristani languages, those are in Afghanistan, show some Magadhi Prakrit features. He lists quite a few. I'll just list some, and you can try them out. But these are, having past participle alai or al or cha instead of the usual her in the Indo-Aryan. You have cha as the auxiliary form, and Pashto apparently has sha and a dative form, vata, which is from bate or bare in Magadhi Prakrit. So this he takes to be evidence to show that there was a presence of Magadhi Prakrit as far as the northwest of India. Now, what it does is it gives us the first glimpse of he's probably the first theories of the two-wave theory, but I deliberately highlight this for a reason. So this is the first two waves theorist of intrusion into India of the Aryan people. Again, a quotation. From these indications, it would appear that the Magadhi tongue is the older of the two. That is, older of the two meaning the West and the East. He's saying the East is actually the older. That is, its occupation of North India preceded the development and extension of Sauraseni. Perhaps this may be taken to point to the fact that two great immigrations of people of the Aryan stock into India took place at different periods, both speaking essentially the same tongue language, though in two different varieties. Okay, so but what this kind of study implies is that Prakrit had their own place. They're not derived from Sanskrit. Whereas if you look at the view from the Orient, not the Orientalist view, and I do not make any apologies for these Orientalist views because I think they're thorough and very good linguists, you will see a different picture altogether. I'm calling it half seriously the Rigged Vedas view, and you'll see why. Because Chatterjee, who is going to be the Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, who is going to be our person for a few minutes, he mentioned in his tome, which is Origin and Development of Bangla Language, which I can show you if you look in the video. This is a big, huge book. There are 3 volumes. And he conjectures that in Rig Veda, there was already an evidence of influence of the East. Okay, so he shows these examples repeated several times in the book. Vikata in place of Vikrita, and Danda in place of Dandra, which is the original reconstructed form of Indo-European and Greek dendon as well. So here you can see further that Rig Veda also mentions, very interestingly, once only, it mentions a country called Kikata. And this country is a home to non-Aryans. Deso Narya, non-Aryans, Nirvasaha. So later Sanskrit writers identify Kikata as Magadha. And interestingly, they are the bards also, the priests were bards, etc. But note that this is non-Aryan, right? And when it comes to Shatpatha Brahmana, most likely 700 BC, describes Easterners as Asurya, demonic in nature. So this impression about the East from the north and the center. And after 1000 BCE, the Aryan tongue was already established in the East, according to these kind of research, that is Bihar, though it is quite transformed, and that will come about, that gives us an opportunity to talk about the language as it was spoken, an idea of the language. So, but if you contrast it with the earlier view, the Orientalist view, you see one distinct difference is that definitely this is Chatterjee is adducing evidence to show that the direction of spread is from northwest to the east, and definitely that implies, at least here it implies, and he says it very clearly in the book and several other articles, that Prakrits are derived from Sanskrit, and that has been the dominant view. Although we saw in case of Hernley, he tried to show that there is evidence that in Nuristan and in Afghanistan, there is evidence of Magadhi. So these are two contrasting views I thought I'll highlight. Another interesting part in the Vedas, from Rig Veda onwards to all the way in all the four Vedas, there is this mention of Asurya, which I already pointed out, but also a new term, Vratyas. And who are these Vratyas? Now let's look at this. In any case, therefore, around 700 BCE, Chatterjee believes that there were two Aryan sets existed in North India, the Vedic and non-Vedic Aryans. So it is all, about North India. And these non-Vedic Aryans are the ones in the East who can, barely speak the Aryan tongue. He thinks that despite the two sets of Aryans, North India of 900 to 600 BCE presented one cultural whole. Okay, so I put this under quote because this is going to be important. And I'm going to show that much later, this view becomes much more complete. And about 4 years before he was awarded the Padma Bhushan, he published a book, which I'll talk about in some detail very soon, where he talks about the same idea of bringing the other within the Aryan fold. Also note that earlier, although he admits that the Eastern references were there as early as in Rig Veda and certainly in Ayurveda and Atharva Veda, are non-Aryan people, Kikata. But later in this pre-Buddhist period of 900 to 600 BC, they become non-Vedic Aryans. This indicates a clear case of proselytization of the East. Thus, the Aryans of the Vedic cults called the non-Vedic Vratyas. So this is what the Vratyas are. There's nothing but a precursor to his idea of composite culture or composite Brahmanism. That was to follow much later in his work in the 1950s. Now, as I said, what about the language of the masses? Because, Prakrit doesn't give us a window to the language of masses, because most of these Prakrit, Maharashtri, Saurashini, even the Magadhi Prakrit, were actually high Prakrit, literary Prakrit. And Paishachi, supposed to be extinct, was actually the language of masses, which gave rise to later Prakrits. But, that research is kind of missing. Now, their speech is described as very interesting here. Adurakta Vakyam Duraktam Ahur, which is not uttered with difficulty as being uttered with difficulty. These are the basically second language speakers with Prakritic influence, form of underlying speech. And they are second language speakers of this so-called Northern Western Indo-Aryan version. So these demonic people of the East, Asura Pratyaya, in fact, he says, demons of the East, also apparently cry out Helavo and Helava. Okay, apparently there's a corrupt form of Hey Arya when they're vanquished by the enemies. Interestingly, vanquished, I've colored it out. They're saying, the mighty enemy, when they are vanquished and they lose their speech forever, which means there was also mass killing, which was accompanying this proselytization of the East. Now I come back to Chatterjee's later 1950s work. It's a great time for India, rebuilding under Nehru, and Chatterjee is one of the architects at taking care of culture, language, etc. He lived in this period I've given you, and Padma Bhushan, I think 55. This is a portrait of Suniti Kumar Chatterjee. His most famous work I showed you already is this book, The Origin and Development of Bengali Language, which was published in 1926. But also he wrote this book, which I'll show you as well. This is the book Kirata Janakriti, which was published in 1951. And this is a picture of the book. Now, we are talking about this not just to highlight the composite Brahmanism, which we already mentioned earlier, but also for a very specific reason of the fourth player in my story. And this fourth player is a Tibeto-Burman group of people. And before I launch into a little bit of linguistics of this talk, let us see how Chatterjee's Brahminical vision engulfs even the Northeast. So here is his glimpse of a little bit of his composite culture in a section titled The Many Racial Linguistic Elements Behind the Unity of India. Chatterjee suggests that the coming together of different races, languages, and cultures has defined the formation of, note, the great body of humanity that is India. Very good. Then you have this, the basic character of the Indian culture for him is composite in nature. What is composite? Before I come to that, let me also introduce the term Kirata, because that is the title of the book. Like, who are these Kiratas? They are talked about very pejoratively in the classical text. Mostly, there's some where they are also praised for their bravery, but the term is mostly used pejoratively as wild non-Aryan tribes living in the mountains. So there's the Himalayan mountains of the Northeast. The cave dwellers, Guha Bhaya, Kiratam, this is in the Ayurveda. Then there's racial stereotyping as well, based on skin color and race. For example, these slokas, I won't read all of them, but I've highlighted crucial parts like Kanchana Druma Sannibham, like a tree of gold. Okay, that's about color. And then also talking about Kirataischa Chinaischa Vrataha Pragjyotisha Bhavat. This is from Mahabharata actually. The Pragjyotisha was, that is Assam, extreme northeast. Assam was then surrounded by Kiratas and Chinas, that is Chinese, and with many other warriors dwelling by the sea coast. That's an interesting part of this quotation, but I won't have time to go into that, the body of water business. But you can see this is some of the gems from this book. So the book is full of such things and much more wilder things, but these are some of the things. Then he doesn't stop there. There's a kind of a physical characterization as well. The original Mongoloid incomers were very primitive people, mostly hunters and food gatherers, who were also cave dwellers. That is about the Himalayan group. It actually chalks out different groups. And then there's about the Nagas. They have largely remained in a very primitive state. And about the people occupying the North Assam tract, they have remained very primitive. So this primitive, very common. They appear rather credulous, at times cruel to both man and beast. They lack depth of thought and possibly lack of feeling or emotion. A habit of indolence after their immediate needs are satisfied seems to be present. So this is very interesting that this is a book which is actually published by the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, that venerable institute, and this seems to have gone unnoticed. So finally, he let loose of his vision. This is the vision of composite Brahmanism. I'll read out for you. Nothing shows better the wonderful power of Brahminical Hinduism than the way in which Mongoloid elements were made under its inspiration to play their great part and to contribute what they could to the sum total of Hindu life and culture. This is a later and more complete version of his vision that we encountered earlier of the composite nature of the Vedic and the non-Vedic Aryans of North India. But and he also has words of praise, of course. Mongoloids were great transmitters of culture received from Hindus. And because they gave successful resistance, they gave to the aggressive spirit of Islam. With that, the door closes and his vision is complete. And you can see very clearly, only with this glimpse of 2 slides, the vision containing one of the great men of India. So, and he concludes that Indian culture is Sanskritic culture. Okay, so quite a bit of that. Now let's come back to little bit of linguistics, or introduce a little bit of linguistics to summarize the period and the movement and the geography in a form of a graph that I have created. The y-axis is time, and the x-axis is geography. So as you go from 1500 BC and come nearer to now, and you go from west to east, you see the spread of languages, and you can follow this at your leisure. But I'll point out certain things. The reason why I am putting this up is this term, which is the title of the slide, Central Magadhan Prakrit, is a term I coined for indicating a group of languages in Bihar and also Jharkhand to some extent. Instead of calling them Bihari languages, Grierson also calls, and all the linguists of that period calls these languages Bihari languages. But we know in our times the term has acquired connotations which are negative. So I thought of this, and this was a work published in 2016. And the reason that this is called central, because this is the central of the three Magadhan Prakrit speeches. Western is something like Bhojpuri, Avdhi also. Central is where we have Maghi, Maithili, Angika, Kurmali. I mentioned only these four because I studied these four. And in the east, you have Assamese, Bangla, Oriya. So these are the Magadhan speeches of the east, and this is called central because I'm concentrating on these languages of Magad, and therefore they're called Magthi Prakrit, therefore they're M, C, M. And then finally, they're of course branches of Prakrit, so they're called CMP languages. This summarizes the linguistic development geographically and temporally, and this coinage which has been introduced. Now, you must have realized by now, I have about 12 minutes left. You have realized by now the importance of this so-called Prakrit. By literally this means belonging to natural speech, but it is also considered to be a fallen speech. So this is a beautiful rendition of the whole idea, and I'll give you the full translation, and the Devanagari version also might be easier to read. Magha desha hai kanchan puri, देश भला पर भाषा पूरी बुरी रहलू magah कहलू रे तेकर लाकी मारवे रे. So it's a beautifully, the poet takes a sort of, this is a poetic witticism in the last line, using a kind of an expression of the East, of Prakrit, of this fallen speech, and asking a rhetorical question, why Ray, do you beat me for doing so? So it gives an impression of the kind of language that Prakrit was perceived to be. But at the same time, it was also an important language. And before I go on to that, you can see the differences between these languages, the CMP languages, and let's say Hindi Urdu or a version of the Sauraseni Prakrit. They diverge quite a bit. And you can read this. So the future is with ba or ga, past is with la or a, genitive, locative, etc. Then etc. The linguistic features, not very crucial. There are lots of phonetic features also, but these clearly mark out these two types of languages. Come back to Hernley. He says it appears perfectly justifiable to consider the Western Hindi and Eastern Hindi as being completely distinct languages. We have already seen his vision. He was the first sort of two ways theory, and he goes all the way back to Northwest. Now, let me introduce in the abstract, I mentioned that I'll take certain linguistic element, and this is the element. This is the term used. This is a linguistic element. I'll keep it as simple as possible, but let me introduce this phenomena briefly, which I've been studying for quite some time now, and I'll show it's relevant for this language, this region, in the next few slides. Roughly, it is a formal representation. Agreement is a formal representation to show a relation between certain words in a sentence which cannot be otherwise expressed in morphology of the language. Meaning it is not that you can dip into the bag of words and get the facts of agreement. You have to have a sentence. So it is a quintessentially sentential or syntactic property. So take these simple examples, two sentences from English, and I have given the colors here. Rani likes momos, and the second example, Rani warmed the momos. So you can see this sa or z with like and d with warm are the ones which indicate various information. But the verb forms themselves, like and warm, verb forms likes and warmed are composed of two things, the stem and the affix. You can see this clearly in the way I've divided them and colored them as well. But they are together on surface, that is when we speak, but they are present, they represent different grammatical categories. Technically, the verb is a V and the affix in this case is either agreement or tense. And you can see this clearly, it's revealed that they're separate, actually, they're not together. In English, very clearly, you can see that when you make a negative version of the first sentence, Rani likes momos, make it Rani does not like dal. And a question version of the second sentence, did Rani warm the momos? You can see clearly the split between the stem and the affix. So here you get that appearing with sort of a dummy verb like do. We won't go into details, but I just wanted to highlight visually for you what is agreement. Now, agreement is really about the connection between these two words, let's say the subject Rani and the verb form. And what is the connection? This connection is, you can see here in the arrow, this indicates person and number for the first sentence. But for the second sentence, it indicates tense. And first sentence, person, number, and tense as well. For the second sentence, it indicates the tense. So these are essential, affixal agreement markers. That's all we need to know to figure out what's going on in the next few slides. Now that we understand what is agreement, let us look at a very special type of agreement. And this is called, this is the title of the slide, multiple agreement phenomenon. And within the Magadhan group that we saw, the CMP group, what distinguishes these languages as well as from the central Middle Indo-Aryan languages is the multiple agreement system. This is, I'm really moving away from the classical text to my own work, but I'll give you reference to the classical ideas, or the rough ideas or the initial ideas about that as well. So take a language, a strange language actually, slight misfit in Europe called Basque. And you can see that object is here in this sentence is me, and there is friend, which is the subject, and there is also the verb. But what about, and I've colored them separately, the object and the subject, but what about the auxiliary? Okay, once you look at the auxiliary, then you'll be surprised to find many things happening in this auxiliary. And you'll see, first of all, if you follow the green color, that's the affix for the object right at the beginning. Okay, that na, which is an absolutive for singular. And then you see the blue color right at the end with the ergative, the 3-1, that indicates the subject. The sentence is, the friend saw me, but both shadows of like me and the friend are reflected in the verb form. But then surprisingly, there is also something else. And what is that? What is this to here? Which person does it indicate? That person, that character is not existent on the sentence, on the surface of the sentence. So who is this person? Well, this is the addressee. And this is the famous case of allocutive or addressee agreement, which is also a common property of this Magadhan speeches and also some other languages. Now the question is, what is this to doing here, and whom does it represent? As I said, it represents the person to whom you're addressing. So clearly, this is a speech-related phenomena when there is a hearer and a speaker. And this is not in all languages, but many languages. Now, we looked at multiple agreement languages. We haven't looked at the language examples yet, but we looked at Basque and we saw that it is not unlike in English. It is not just subject, the shadow of the subject which falls onto the verb, but shadow of the subject and the object, right? So the friend saw me, you have shadow of me as well as the friend in the sentence. Okay, so that's a multiple agreement. And on top of that, Basque also has another shadow, which person does not exist in the sentence. However, question arises, is the English type languages more common or these type of languages? From looking at the survey of the field, if you see how this agreement phenomena was studied, now, people who are to be blamed is us, the syntacticians. we're actually looking at a tiny corner of the world. And this can become very clear if you look at this, not perfect, but a good representative of agreement in the world languages. This is the WALS Atlas map. And here the red dots are the English type languages, or languages which show agreement only with one thing, like subject or object. Okay, the yellow dotted ones are the ones which show agreement with multiple things, like one subject and also another one, maybe the object. Now you can see, yellow clearly wins this number game. Yellow spots dominate over red spots. In spite of this, our little history of syntactic studies of agreement really concentrates on this bunch of languages in this corner of the world, namely European languages, but not just all European languages, the Germanic languages, that is English, German, Scandinavian languages, and Romance languages like French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and concentrates for that reason only on single argument languages. Now let's go back to Chatterjee now linguistically briefly. He encountered this phenomena. Of course he will encounter, because it was encountered before him, 30, 40 years before him. And he gives these comments, the intricacies of that later Maithili. Maithili is one of the languages of the CMP group, were absent in old Maithili. When he talks about old Maithili, he's talking about Maithili of Vidyapati, because he doesn't want to go far back to 10th century of the Charyapadas, because Charyapadas, according to Chatterjee, are Bengali. But many Maithili scholars would claim that they are earlier Maithili. So he says that Vidyapati's language was especially noticeable in the simplicity of the verb system, with its freedom from the ramifications of pronominal affixes. I'll have to wrap up soon, I think. The metaphors used in Chatterjee are clear giveaway that he is not able to understand this agreement system. But Grierson, much before him and others, had earlier detected this phenomena, and he had this to say: the principal difficulty to the beginner of the study of Maithili is the bewildering maze of the verbal forms. This is due to the fact, and clearly here, the verb agrees not only with the subject, but with the object as well. Chatterjee further conjectures maybe this is a case of contact phenomena from the south. So let's say a contact situation like this, these things which are in dotted lines are groups of languages which are Austroasiatic languages or Munda languages, and I've given the names, I don't know if you can see, and maybe these languages influenced this. Look at the facts of Indo-Aryan, and these are the 4 languages I studied. I'll pause here a little bit and ask the organizers, how long do I have? Ira, do I have about 10 minutes? Okay, everybody is muted, I guess. So let me look at the multiple agreement, show you the multiple agreement phenomena. This is a sentence from Maithili. And
you can take, say 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes more.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's all I need. So this Maithili sentence, O Tora Dekhal Thun, here you can see again visually, I'll show that there is a shadow of the subject in the verb, but also a shadow of the object in the verb. Unlike Basque, you can't separate these in Maithili at least, but in other languages you can. But there are 2 agreement morphemes which are fused together. And you see this is the pattern. Now, Chatterjee sort of conjectures that could it be from the Munda languages, but the phenomenon in Munda languages is quite different. This is a map of the Munda languages taken from this book. And you can see the colored ones of the Munda languages, mostly to the east, but also an isolate in Madhya Pradesh, and there is one in Maharashtra border as well. So these Munda languages could have influence, but Munda language also have the shadows of these arguments in the verb form, but they're of a different type. First of all, let's look at an example from Arun Ghosh's work. So this was the example. You can see the colors again. All you need is a verb form, right? And you can say he strikes or will strike for me, a benefactive for me. And these two affixes for the subject and the object or the beneficiary are mentioned. In the earliest views of clitics, a lot of people worked on Munda languages, and these are some of the views. So Hoffman in 1903, in his Mundari grammar, he says they give you the semblance of a conjugation. But these European scholars had some strange ideas about pronominalization. For example, Hodgson, who had done great work, and I'm a fan of his work. Actually, this is a book that is his biography. He remarks in connection with the paucity of conjugational forms is that the root people think much more of the actors than action. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but actors are these shadows that I'm talking about in non-theoretical terms, the shadows, rather than the action, which is the verb itself. So it's an interesting take on this whole idea. Now, these are two different systems. You saw the Maithili system, which is there again for you. And then there is this Munda system, which is different. And Kashmiri also shows pronominal clitic. These are called clitics rather than affixes. And there are clear-cut differences between clitics and affixes. Well, mostly, and I've listed some of them. We don't have to go to it. Let's take a sort of side road where this British, Irish, Scottish grammarians at that time looking at some of these languages and came up with this very mythical beast, a very interesting construct called Turanian languages. And Max Muller in his book, which was called, I think the title of the book was The Languages of the Seat of the War in the East. He surveys these three types of languages, and he says there are three types of major languages in the whole of the world, which is Aryan and Semitic and Turanian. Turanian is kind of a waste paper basket, as I've written here. The third type of family is Turanian. Whatever you can't put in the first two baskets, you put into Turanian. Interestingly for us, he also, and Hodgson also says, includes something like Tamulians, that is actually Dravidian, Tibetans, Indo-Chinese. Max Muller doesn't include Chinese also, because he believes that the grammar of Chinese is not the kind of grammar we are used to. So it's a grammarless language, according to him. This creation is due to the overzealousness in mapping the world, and partly dictated by war reasons. For example, they don't consider some of the languages like Tungusic languages because they are not likely to appear in the theater of war. And of course, he doesn't look at the African languages or the languages of Americas because they are minor variations of these three types. Now, in this connection, Hodgson also mentions this phrase, which is part of my title. Although he unites the Himalayas, Indochina, and Tibet, which is the correct way of looking at it, of the language family, and calls it Tibeto-Burman, considers the languages to be marked by some kind of syntactic poverty. The kind of languages he was looking at, Tibeto-Burman languages he was looking at, are the Tibeto-Burman languages of Nepal, the Kiranti languages. Okay, Kiranti, that's a term. Kirati we talked about already. Among other traits, Hodgson 56 lists a series of facts, one of them being verb pronominalization, which according to him offers evidence of genetic relation between the Turanian languages. So this is the substratum influence theory, which I won't have time to go through, so I'll skip that. But let's go to Tibeto-Burman languages. And various authors have sort of started thinking, where do these so-called Magadhan languages have this feature? Chatterjee we saw, and also Grierson, they thought of this push from the south of the Munda languages. But then there were a lot of discussion among this British Irish things, and much later, a great recitation Bowman, who convincingly argues that the pronominalization that you see in the Tibeto-Burman languages is of a different nature. Okay, in fact, we see this same phenomena that we saw in the Indo-Aryan languages like Maithili, Maghi. We see this in Munda languages, I showed you Santali, Mundari, but we see this also in Tibeto-Burman. Kokichin, especially, which is the southern of southern Mizoram area, also in Myanmar, and Kiranti languages, the Eastern Nepal languages, some of the language names I've given here. Now, I'm nearing the end, and this is the same kind of examples you can see in, this is the Chintang language, Kiranti language of Nepal, and you can see the same kind of phenomena of two shadows on the verb. And this is the rough area of the Tibeto-Burman languages which show this phenomenon. So this is my proposal, that this is there are these three groups of languages. The one in magenta are the Tibeto-Burman languages in the Himalayan zone. You can see that arrow, and also in the in the east, and the green one also Tibeto-Burman. That's the Kuki-Chin languages, southern Mizoram, Myanmar. Then you have the Indo-Aryan languages, which I studied and I showed you Maithili example, and then the Munda languages pushing from the south with the same kind of features. But the idea is that all these features are of different types, and there is still something unexplainable, a vast chunk of the Northeast, which languages don't show any agreement at all. And I have a different idea about that, but that's not part of this paper. Now, interestingly, there is a good book. It's a book in Bangla, which I can show you. This is the book, and I've given you the title here, Biswas 2008, Ashok Biswas. And this whole book is about the Tibeto-Burman substratum of Bangla. And I've listed some place names, some rituals, some music, also some grammar, where you see repeated appearance of Tibeto-Burman recalcitrant forms in Bangla. So this is my final proposal. Given this concentration, we moved away from the north, we have come to the east, but we discovered these other groups of people. We find a genetic evidence which suggests that east is really the diversity, is a melting pot. It is the gateway to the diversity, and this is for a reason, the reasons that I have outlined in the rest of the paper, as it represents contact and migration into linguistic patterns that reveal which are different from the dominant northern variety. And this is just a genetic study which shows that this little, I think this arrow is there, that little circle there, it has the maximum number of haplotypes for any geographical area in India. So this is kind of a genetic sort of evidence. There's more to say about it, but I don't have time. And finally, I will leave you. So that's the end of the talk, but the commentary, but the talk continues, and I'll leave you finally with this little something. This is a photograph from the Weimar region in Germany in September 2000, so more than 20 years ago. I have this photograph is a prized possession. I took this photo, and this was a time when Jenny was visiting Hani in Jena, where he was doing his second PhD under Joseph Bayer, who will be appearing later in the evening. And I was a research scientist in Leipzig, another area in the former East Germany, both incidentally well-known centers in their each way. Jena for almost the birth of Marxist studies, and Leipzig for important studies in Indology. So it's very interesting that these kind of things are coming together. And I leave you with this photograph instead of my references, which are 2 pages I have, but I won't bore you with that. And with that, I finish this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanmoy.